Support for this podcast comes from Invent Together. I bet you didn't know that inventing activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899, and it has never recovered. Black and Hispanic college graduates patented half the rate of white college graduates. That's just one of the reasons why you need to know about Invent Together. When our patent system gets more diverse, our nation will get stronger and more successful. Find out how you can help diverse inventors and unleash economic opportunity at inventtogether.org.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Christian Studies, a channel on the New Books Network podcast. I'm your host, Crawford Gribben. Today, my guest is Shushma Malik. We're talking to Shushma today about her new book. Shushma is a lecturer in classics at University of Roehampton, and at the end of last year, Cambridge University Press published her incredibly impressive book, The Nero Antichrist, Founding and Fashioning a Paradigm. Shushma, congratulations on the book, and thank you for coming onto the show to talk about it.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Crawford. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. But before we talk about the book, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? As we were saying before we began recording, it's not everyone develops an interest in the eschatological identity of Nero. How did you come to do so?
Absolutely. Yes, no, it's a slightly odd thing to develop an interest in, isn't it? No, I'm a Roman historian. So I studied at the University of Bristol for all three of my degrees, and when I was an undergraduate, I took a course on Nero that had a small part in it about Nero's sort of legacy in Christian history and his interpretation in the Bible as well as how it was presented. And back then it was something that sort of stuck in the back of my mind and was something that I thought would be interesting to look at in more detail. I wondered how secure that evidence was, what led people to interpret Nero in that way at that time. But then I forgot about it completely, started doing my master's on another Roman emperor, Elagabalus, who's also fascinating. But then came back to it at a PhD level and thought, well, actually, this is a good time with the amount of space I had, with the brilliant supervisor I had, to be able to explore this in more detail and really start to understand why it is Nero was used in this way, because it is, of course, unusual to see the legacy of really anyone go in such a particular direction for such a prolonged period of time. So it was a sort of slow burner to get to Nero as eschatological adversary, but I got there in the end.
Good. Well, it might have been a slow burner, but it was worth the wait. And this new book is really compelling and really interesting.
Thank you.
So, as we work our way towards the book, could you tell us a little bit about how the early Christians felt about the Roman Empire, just generally to set the scene before we talk about Nero and the Antichrist figure particularly?
Sure. Yeah, so in terms of when we're talking about Nero, we're in the 1st century AD. He was emperor from 54 to 68, so we're in the very early period after the foundation of Christianity. Of course, you know, our dating system is based on that rough idea, but if you think that Christ was crucified probably under the Emperor Tiberius in the 30s, if we're sort of using a rough dating chronology, and then we're only about 20, 30 years later when we get to Nero. So we're still in very early stages, but we do have, you know, some bits of evidence. Things like the letters of St. Paul, for example, are very useful for trying to get a grip of, like you say, how Christianity was perceived in this period and also how Christians perceived the Roman Empire. We are on scant evidence. There is some. We're on limited evidence, but there was. But what comes through Paul's letters and what comes through our sources is a sense of, on the one hand, trying to live with the Roman Empire, so living with the emperors. Paul himself, for example, is a Roman citizen because of the family that he comes from, and there is an idea that, you know, Christians can fit within particular parts of the established structure of the Roman Empire and do fit in. However, there's also quite a number who probably don't or don't want to fit in, and part of the sort of perception of early Christianity from the Roman or pagan perspective, I should say, because they're all Romans to some extent, or freed citizens or free members of the Roman Empire. There's an idea also that perhaps the established sort of civic structures that are based on that are very related to pagan structures. Traditional Greco-Roman religion is political as well as it is, the way we would think of religion. And Christianity sits outside of that. It's not that Roman society couldn't take in Christianity as a cult. It certainly could. There are lots of different Eastern cults in particular that the Roman Empire and that Rome very successfully syncretized into its own structures. Part of perhaps the problem that started to emerge, not necessarily this early on, but certainly started to emerge with Christianity in that sense, was the idea of monotheism. So that a God would want you to worship them and them alone. And that to a pagan is a slightly odd concept, I think. And it's not alien. You've got Jews, of course, at this time as well. There's a way for the Romans to deal with this, but as Christians in the early empire, if you wanted to, for example, make your religion known or try and convert people, that would be a very difficult process to go through from the perspective of someone who is pagan, who doesn't necessarily quite understand the idea of conversion in that sense, in the way that we think of it anyway, as adhering to just one God and doing completely converting. So while there was in the beginning an idea that the Romans and the and Christians should kind of live together, should be able to function. I think it's in Acts where there's a line about honor. Peter says that's supposed to have said honor the emperor, because the emperor has been put on the earth by, that structure has been put on the earth by God. So honor him, and then you will receive your benefit once you have died, and whoever needs judgment will be judged by God. So there is that sort of train of thought, but then there's also perhaps the more Pauline train of thought, which is also to do with being able to uphold Christian values in a structure that doesn't necessarily understand exactly or isn't that familiar with what Christian values really are.
And that takes us, I suppose, very nicely to think about Nero himself. So he comes to power roughly 20 years after the crucifixion of Christ, and he's gone by about AD 68, and maybe we'll talk in a few moments about how that happens. And so really within 30 years of the crucifixion event, we have the emergence of this emperor who comes to be seen as embodying so many of the traits of this composite figure that we call the Antichrist, whose personality and characteristics are drawn from so many different parts of that body of writing. Why did Nero, or how did Nero come to have such a negative view, and how did he come to be identified as this biblical Antichrist figure?
Okay, so exactly as you said, Nero is very close in proximity to this formative period in Christianity to some extent. Not only in the first century, I mean, Christian literature is still writing. We've got Christian writers, we've got ideas trying to formulate and fully kind of be articulated for another 100 years, 200 years after that as well. But we do have what we have with Nero is an emperor who was clearly sort of controversial in his time. I don't think it's a case that, everybody loved him. I don't think it's necessarily a case that everybody hated him either. I think like with most political figures we can think of, probably some people really liked him and some people really didn't. What's interesting about Nero, though, is that from the sort of source tradition that we get that emerges after his death. So not necessarily when he was alive, because there is evidence. We have evidence of there being a very mixed reception for Nero in the histories. A Jewish writer, in fact, named Josephus in the late 1st century says that there are many histories written of Nero. Some are good, some are bad, some loved him, some hated him, some were being sycophants, some, were deliberately trying to assassinate his character. As we would expect, there are lots of different receptions of Nero. What we have is the very particular sort of senatorial or imperial hostile tradition. It's not uniformly hostile. There are some good bits you can pick out, certainly, but overall sort of, not particularly pro-Nero tradition that comes up, about a generation and a couple of generations after his reign. So here I'm talking about Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. There are 3 narrative sources. Tacitus is writing under the Emperor Trajan. Suetonius, probably around the same time, Trajan, Hadrian, and then Cassius Dio a little bit later. So we're talking late 2nd century, early 3rd century, under a different dynasty, the Severans. So we do have a sort of much later establishing of a tradition about Nero. At the beginning, it was probably very mixed, but then one particular tradition, that senatorial tradition, gets pushed forward. And when we get to late antiquity, by which I mean sort of the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD, we start to get sort of potted histories, if you like, or potted biographies of emperors. These are things that people who were just coming to literacy, our population of the empire is expanding, lots of different types of people entering the army, that sort of thing. And to get the sort of potted histories of these emperors, it's very clear from those that the Nero that emerges, and the Nero that emerges is the one that we know, the tyrant, the completely maniacal image of an ancient leader that we still see sort of in popular receptions today. And that became the way of thinking about Nero, and part of the reason I think why he then gets related to the Antichrist is because that idea of tyranny, the way that Nero encapsulates tyranny so wholly, helps people who are converting to Christianity or who are from different social structures understand what an antichrist means. An antichrist is destructive, like an emperor can be destructive, like Nero can be destructive, and that's quite a powerful concept to play with as for example a bishop or someone who is delivering homilies or someone who is writing commentaries on earlier Christian literature. How do we understand these prophecies? How do we understand the text we now call the Bible, but of course back then that canonical process was still going on? How do we make sense of Revelation? It's a difficult text. How do you do that? How do you relate that to a general audience? And Nero is extremely useful there for the reasons I've just outlined, but for one other reason as well, which is during his reign in AD 64, there was a fire in Rome, and a great number of buildings were destroyed, houses and so forth, shops. And there were rumours going around, because Nero was very enthusiastic about rebuilding Rome. It was sort of his artistic dream, if you like, to be able to architecturally plan the city. And he did a very good job at it, even the hostile sources say so. But in his enthusiasm for wanting to rebuild Rome, rumours started to go around that he set fire to the city himself so that he could then carry out his grand architectural plan. And Tacitus tells us, in order to get rid of those rumours, he decided to blame a group of people in Rome who were not particularly popular, who had sort of established themselves as sort of outliers of Roman society. They didn't quite, fit well with civic structures, as we've been talking about before. People didn't quite know what to do with them, and that was a group that was known as Christians. So Tacitus tells us, and because then Christians were killed by Nero, he then was responsible for the first persecution, what was called a persecution, but execution really, the first execution of Christians since the crucifixion of Christ. And that is incredibly important to the way that Nero was then later understood.
And you explain in the book that that's really the context, or the supposed context, for the deaths both of Peter and of Paul. And that, I suppose, leads us into a discussion of the death of Nero himself, because he too dies, or does he, quite soon after this. Could you just explain, as you do in the book, the circumstances around Nero's death and the stories that proliferated around that, and also perhaps move towards this idea of Nero, of pseudo-Neros who return, and perhaps tell us what that's all about.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to bring in Peter and Paul, because that is, again, a very important part of this. It's this is established a bit later on, so kind of in the 2nd century, I think, is one of the first references we see to this. But in the Christian imagination, I would say, the deaths of Peter and Paul get swept up with that bigger narrative of the persecution, of the execution of Christians. So Peter is supposed to have been in Rome at the time, and therefore caught up in that persecution. Paul, of course, as we were talking about earlier, was a Roman citizen, so had particular rights, and actually wasn't swept up in that particular episode, although, like I say, later in the Christian imagination he was included in it, but rather he, or in that same time period, rather he is executed by Nero because he has been arrested for inciting a riot, brought to Rome, and is executed. So yeah, Nero is responsible, is seen as is then made responsible for those for the deaths of two founders of the Christian Church as well, which is not great for his legacy. And like you say, we have got also very interesting rumours about how Nero dies and what happens at his death. And they're interesting because in our 3 narrative histories, we don't have his death in Tacitus, unfortunately, because we've lost any bits of the work that it would be in the annals. We don't have books, most of book 16 or books after that, so we don't have the last 2 years of his reign. But in Suetonius and in Cassius Dio, his death is very straightforward, actually. He is declared a public enemy by the Senate. He knows that he has to flee, and then he realizes that he has to, if he doesn't commit suicide, then he will be killed by the Praetorian Guard. So he goes to, manages to get to a villa of his freedman, Theon, on the outskirts of the city. And there we get, very theatrical and imaginative death scenes in the sources, which are wonderful to read. But he commits suicide with the help of one of his freedmen in the end. And that seems fairly straightforward. He has a funeral. It's a public funeral. He is buried on the Esquiline, I think it is, with his natural father, so not the emperor, but his natural family tomb, birth family tomb, I should say. And then so that all seems fairly, straightforward and not particularly problematic. But what does become problematic is that in the East, we start to get people popping up saying, Nero is not dead, I am Nero. Come follow me. It's sort of Spartacus, but not quite. And we have an account in Tacitus, actually, in another book that he writes, the Histories, which cover the years of the Civil War and onwards. And we also have it in Cassius Dio, and a little bit of a reference in Suetonius as well, that there were 2, perhaps 3 of these people. So immediately in the context of civil war, you can sort of see why that might happen. There's a civil war going on in Rome. There are emperors who actually follow Nero. So the first emperor in that period, Galba, is very much against Nero. He positions himself as a return to, not the Republic. He's still an emperor, but something that's a bit more traditional in terms of Roman values, not the young youth of Nero. He's much older. He's an established general, that sort of thing. He's positioned himself that way, but he only lasts for about 6 months. The next two people who become emperors, Otho and Vitellius, are both much more Neronian. Otho was a very good friend of Nero. Nero's second wife was married to Otho at one point, Poppaea. So their connection to Nero is quite close, and they see themselves as his successors. So in Rome, there's sort of a bit of a mix of a feeling of what to do with Nero, I think, still at this point. So in the East, we get someone popping up saying, well, I am Nero, and trying to come back to Rome and claim the throne, essentially. He distinguishes himself as Nero by being very good at doing things like playing the lyre, which Nero was as well. And manages to amass a following in the East, because Nero was probably very popular still in the East. And so we're talking sort of Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. He comes through there. And then eventually the Roman army sort of deal with him quite promptly. He gets killed, and his body or his head, the Latin isn't quite clear, get taken back to Rome, and everyone says, oh, that does look a bit like Nero. And then we sort of go from there. And that happens. It's only really the first one that's sort of given a proper go, if you like, that's taken seriously. But afterwards it's a bit sort of, well, they're a few odd people saying they're Nero, and they're dealt with very, very quickly. Certainly the sources sort of dismiss it as a sort of a weird occurrence that is happening in the East, probably due to Nero's popularity, probably due to the fact that this is the end of the first dynasty. So Augustus was the founder of the dynasty of the Julio-Claudians. Nero was the fifth and last emperor in that dynasty. So that's a sort of watershed moment in what's going to happen politically, what's going to happen in terms of the system of emperors, the Principate, and it's not necessarily that surprising that it's Nero that these things happen to. Also, in the context of civil war, there's much more. It's much easier to say, "I am Nero." I didn't die. I fled. What you saw, that funeral, it was all a fake. I actually fled, and here I am back. And because of the confusion of civil war, because of that context, perhaps someone thought that was the right time to do it, but. It certainly, as being the last person in the dynasty, is calling to an end that period of the Julio-Claudians, might possibly be why this happens with Nero rather than, with anyone else.
So the connection then is made very firmly in the minds of many Christian writers between Nero and this Antichrist figure. And your book explains that holds for the first 4 or 5 centuries, and then gradually begins to dissipate. So why does Nero stop being the Antichrist?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's Nero because that story that he was dead and then not dead gets changed into a sort of resurrection story. So Nero redivivus, which means Nero returned to life. So that translates quite nicely into the idea of someone who was an emperor in Rome who died, who will be resurrected at the last, at the apocalypse, essentially, or in an eschatological context, in the context of the end of the world, to then come and fulfill that role again, that persecutor role again, that a bringer of the apocalypse, the representative of the devil on earth. So that works really nicely as a way of talking about that. And the false Neros, of course, play into that so wonderfully as well. But like you say, we do get this this spread of the idea of Nero in this way, fulfilling this role, coming back at the end times to bring about the apocalypse. That carries on, not uniformly accepted. Some writers are more interested in that idea than others. Lactantius, for example, talks about it in quite a lot of detail, but it says only crazy people believe this. Others are much more convinced. Jerome, for example, when he's writing a letter to one of his correspondents, a noblewoman, she's asked him, what does Paul mean in 2 Thessalonians when he says, the man of lawlessness, the mystery of iniquity, the Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians. And he says, well, he means Nero. This is who Paul was talking about. This is who will return at the end to bring about the end times. So there were different people responding to it differently, but certainly there was you can see a thread of this idea not going away, certainly. And then we get to Augustine, and I do find Augustine very interesting because he is he was so influential, particularly in the Middle Ages. So what Augustine said was obviously taken very, very seriously, and he did not think that Nero was the Antichrist. He did not think we should interpret Paul in that way in particular. He did not think the mystery of iniquity and the man of lawlessness responded to a person. He thought they were concepts. He thought they were ideas that were about the workings of good and evil in the relationship between the city of God and the city of man, which is, and this comes in his sort of great work, The City of God. And so he understands things on a very different, far less literal, I would say, level. And that, I think, then becomes quite pervasive. We do get references to Nero as the Antichrist after Augustine, particularly his disciples carry on with that, some of those ideas. Orosius, when he's writing his potted history, and also Quodwalt Deus, another Christian author, makes mention of it, reference to it as well. And then it does come up in other biblical interpretations and Revelation in particular. So it does crop up again in later works. But what I find interesting is that there's no development of it after late antiquity. So we don't get new ideas about what this is. And it's mainly resigned to Nero is maybe the first beast in Revelation, is probably the first beast in Revelation. He is 666. That becomes the way of sort of understanding that piece of biblical literature for some, but not very pervasively. So of course in the Middle Ages, going into later periods as well, we get a whole sort of plethora of different ways of understanding the Antichrist, and we're not in that sort of Roman emperor context anymore. Nero becomes less useful, and what we do see, for example, is other figures sort of being able to take up that role. For example, popes. So unsuccessful popes, or popes who were decided that they should be perceived as unsuccessful after their deaths, then become prime candidates for being constructed as the Antichrist, in ways where you can make lots of names add up to 666 if you want to, and you can bring out those traits of tyranny and murder and capriciousness and all of those sorts of things to understand the Antichrist for an audience for whom Nero isn't necessarily as useful anymore. He is certainly the archetype, is still a tyrant. He is still very much understood as a tyrant, but perhaps a more relevant example would be, in later periods, a pope or another leader. Of course, you can imagine with the Reformation that goes in all sorts of different directions as well.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the founder and editor of the New Books Network. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably love to read. I know I do. So I'd like to recommend you subscribe to Scribd. Scribd is the ultimate reading subscription service, letting you explore all of your interests in any format you choose: ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and more for only $9.99 a month. All your favorite things are there. You get an entire library for less than the cost of a single book. No complicated credit cards or additional purchases required. If you're not sure what to read, Scribd combines the latest technology with the best human minds to recommend content that you'll love. Want to change things up? You're free to switch between titles, genres, and formats at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And here's the best news. Right now, Scribd is offering NBN listeners a free 60-day trial. Go to try.scribd.com/NBN for your free trial. That's try.scribd.com/NBN to get 60 days of Scribd for free.
And the final section of your book, Shushma, talks about the way in which the idea of Nero's Antichrist gets revived in the 19th century. And there, as you explained, it's very much in the context of intra-Christian debate and concern, I think, among many of your, several of your 19th century subjects, that actually more needs to be done to pull Christians together and so to find an alternative Antichrist figure. And so you give us a Catholic thinker, a Protestant thinker, and someone who's moving between the two to help us see how that happens in the 19th century. Could you briefly just talk us through what that section of the book was all about?
Sure. So the 19th century reception of Nero is so fascinating because the idea is developed again. So it's picked up and it's run with in a really interesting way. It's like you say by my examples are Ernest Renan, who is Catholic, Frederick William Farrer, who's Protestant, and then Oscar Wilde, who might seem like the odd one out there, but actually isn't, because he is very interested in lots of the themes, and he knows his Renan, he knows his Farrer. We know from his book request lists and all sorts of things that he had copies of these books, and he was a great reader of Renan actually when he was at university as well. But the idea of what happens in the 19th century is that in order to kind of understand or to give a historical perspective, if you like, to some of the sectarian debates that are going on. So think of the Oxford movement, the rise of Anglo-Catholicism in this period, John Henry Newman, John Keble, these sorts of people. We get also the idea of papal antichrist coming back in as a reaction to that in quite a profound way. We also have a particularly controversial pope at this time as well. And in order to sort of come back at that, one of the things Ernest Renan does when he writes his 7-volume history of Christianity is he dedicates the 4th volume to Nero, and it's called The Antichrist. And he says, no, look back at your sources, look back at your Lactantius, look back at your Augustine. Even though Augustine doesn't believe him, he still cites him, but doesn't believe it. But he says, look back at your late antiquity, look back at your church fathers. It isn't the Pope, it isn't anyone that contemporary political figures. It's Nero. Nero is the Antichrist. Read your sources and you will see this. But one of the interesting things that Renan does is he not only talks about Nero coming back at the time of the apocalypse, Nero shall be the beast, he will be the Antichrist, in a context of Revelation. He also makes Nero's reign itself feel like an apocalypse when he's describing it, because he's writing an account of Nero. His 7-volume history of Christianity goes from the life of Jesus to Marcus Aurelius. In historical terms, he's in the 1st century AD. And Frederick William Farrer runs with this. He really does. And he knows Renan's work as well, cites him regularly, not just that book, but others too, his life of Christ in particular. And we get a rendering then through Frederick William Farrer in a 2-volume historical novel called Darkness and Dawn, or Scenes from the Days of Nero, in historical fiction, so much more popular than Renan's Antichrist, a conception of Nero's reign as the apocalypse. So that's a really kind of interesting and vivid and moving as well way of talking about Nero's role, putting Nero's role into giving it a different resonance, making Nero himself not a reborn Nero, but Nero himself is the Antichrist during his reign. He also Frederick William Farrer rewrites sort of history, if you like, to say that John of Patmos even was probably in Rome during this period. He writes him in as a character. He makes Nero's stepbrother and first wife who are brother and sister, Britannicus and Octavia, as sort of proto-Christian figures. He actually has, one of them convert. And there are these, obviously very clear historical sort of playing around here. He's taking quite a few liberties with the history, but he does create this absolutely extraordinary picture of a Neronian period as an apocalyptic period. As John would then go on to write it in Revelation, he makes that very clear connection. So that then kind of goes on into later film history. One of the novels that Farrar influenced extremely was Heinrich Sienkiewicz's Quo Vadis, which then goes on into film history. Of course, the immortal Peter Ustinov plays Nero in the 1950s. But before we get there, as it were, one of the other people who really plays around or tries to understand Nero from the perspective of religion, but also from the perspective of how that religious history fits with Nero's reign, is Oscar Wilde. And it might not sound like it's an obvious place to go with Oscar Wilde, but actually reading his letters in particular, this doesn't come through his plays. Of course, those familiar with his plays will be wondering what on earth I'm talking about. But a little bit in his Picture of Dorian Gray, in the chapter where he talks about Nero and he talks about the decadence of Nero, we get sort of some understandings of how he's construing Nero as an emperor, as a decadent figure. Nero was an artist as well. He was an emperor who acted on stage. That's one of the reasons why some historians really hated him, because to have an emperor acting on stage was quite a scandal. So for Nero to be, on the one hand, the emperor aesthete, he is the ideal for some of the people in the decadent movements. Also to have this very profound reception history that is circulating at the time, the 1880s, the 1890s. Ernest Renan wrote in 1873, Frederick William Farrar, the early 1890s. And Picture of Dorian Gray sort of comes in between those, as it were. And you get the idea that lots of these ideas are swirling around in Oscar Wilde's head, and they come out through his letters. He talks about Oscar Wilde talks about his own personal kind of relationship with both Catholicism and Protestantism, because on the one hand he comes from a Protestant family, but Catholicism has always fascinated him. He plays around with the idea of conversion, particularly when he's at university at Oxford, at the Oxford of John Henry Newman. So it's all sort of tying up together. But he very much uses Nero, I think, as a way to understand how these ideas can go together, how decadence and religion and sin and scandal work together in the body of one person, because that is also Nero. It's Wilde. He sort of uses Nero as a way to talk about lots of the things that happen to him, particularly when he goes to jail, and he writes about his life with Alfred Douglas, the life that got him convicted of gross indecency in 1895. He talks about his productivity and his lack of it, and then he talks about his religion and the way to understand Christ as the supreme individual. It's philosophically, of course, driven. It's theologically driven, but it's also driven, or also used to articulate those drivers. Is Nero? He is a sinner. And he is also the Antichrist, but he can be redeemed. And that's one of the things that Wilde says about Nero, that he can be redeemed. And as Nero can be redeemed, so can Wilde, as it were. And Nero works wonderfully as a way to articulate all of these things, precisely because he is so multi-layered. He is the emperor of the first century. He's the emperor who got up on stage and acted. He is the emperor who is supposed to have killed his mother, to have killed some of his wives, 2 of his wives. He is the emperor who, on the other hand, was a popular with the people, who, after his death, some said that he was still alive, wished him still to be alive. He was popular enough to get a following in the then becomes the Antichrist, and all of those things together, which gets with century, all of these kind of ideas floating around at work so imaginatively in Oscar Wilde's letters and in some of his works, in the way that he thinks about all of these things, that he is a wonderful person to study for Nero.
Well, Shushma Malik, it's been great talking to you today about your new book, The Nero Antichrist, Founding and Fashioning a Paradigm, just published by Cambridge University Press. Before we wind up today, could you tell us what you are working on next, what we might be able to look forward to seeing in the future?
Wonderful. Yes. So at the moment, I'm working on a project that's I'm collaborating on with a colleague at Roehampton and also with colleagues in Germany as well. It's a British and German project funded by the AHRC and the DFGA, and that's on corruption. So it's called Twisted Transfers, and we're looking at ideas of corruption, which of course kind of have some relationships back to some of this things we've been talking about as well. But I'm also thinking about how corruption is articulated in historiography of the imperial period, so under the emperors, in various different ways. So in terms of power transfer of the emperors, but also in terms of other transfers that take place, for example, citizenship, the widening of citizenship, I'm very interested in as well. So that's what's next. Great.
Well, that sounds like a great project and exciting, especially with the collaboration. But anyway, Thank you for your time today and for coming on to the show to talk about this new book, The Nero Antichrist, Founding and Fashioning a Paradigm, just published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you for your time and take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And thanks to everyone else for listening in today. I'll see you next time on New Books in Christian Studies, a channel on the New Books Network podcast.